I used to run around using the other juxtaposition, that the United States and Canada together are now spending somewhat more than $3 billion a week to fight the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we haven't been able to summon more than $10 billion in any year to counter a pandemic which has taken 25 million lives and has 33 million people in its grip. And I must say that there are other aspects of these fateful juxtapositions which are unsettling. Like some people here, I watched the somewhat bizarre vice presidential debate in the United States. And in the course of it, you will remember that the moderator asked the two contestants, given the financial crisis and the likely reduction in spending power, what is it that would be cut? And it was Joe Biden who answered. And he said it was very difficult to predict what would be cut at this point, but he thought they would probably start with, quote, foreign assistance, close quote. So it's really important to understand much of the writing that is on the wall. The fourth point I wanted to make was that the agreement of people like Jeffrey Sachs, who is such an authentic and in a sense, establishment economist with enormous credentials, the agreement of a Jeffrey Sachs, who is the advisor on the Millennium Development Goals, that the absence of the additional $25 billion will make all the difference in the world, was given further force by Jeffrey's own fascinating study on the Macroeconomic Commission on Health, which he did for the World Health Organization, in which he demonstrated that it's perfectly possible to confront and subdue poverty over the short and long term if the dollars are there and the policies are in place. But he pointed out that you've got to deal with the social sectors first. You have to deal with health and education and nutrition and water and sanitation before you can begin to move to economic growth. And it is a profound fallacy to think that you can do one in advance of the other. And those, of course, were the arguments that were made by the Richard Jollies of this world when he was the deputy executive director of UNICEF, and the World Bank and the IMF were putting into place the structural adjustment programs, which did such terrible damage to the social sectors. And of course, the elements of conditionality and the elements of user fees are still providing painful consequences today. And although the World Bank has apologized and admitted publicly it was wrong and said that its economic design was flawed and that it should never have been imposed, the fact of the matter is that the consequences continue to be felt, and Sachs's study demonstrates the veracity of the analysis. And that leads me to the fifth point I wanted to make, which was that the recent emergence of the WHO Commission on the Social Determinants of Health said categorically that poverty is the ultimate determinant of health, and that inequality is what drives this world, and that is almost always fatal in its application for the impoverished societies. So there is a tremendous compendium of evidence amassed that we are dealing with a subject which is profoundly intractable in the mass, although we know, and you certainly know at community level, that whole lives can be transformed by inspired and creative interventions. And the final stamp in the litany of anxiety is, of course, what Robert referred to, which is the emergence of climate change. And it's worth pointing out that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its last report, indicated that the force of global warming would be felt most grievously in southern Africa, in direct conjunction in those countries which are struggling with the highest prevalence rates of HIV in the world, and that there will be even more intense droughts, even more intense hunger, even more intense famine, and probably conflict over water. And the people who have dispassionately appraised global warming, people like Sir Nicholas Stern, a former vice president of the World Bank, not some closet Maoist, but an extraordinarily open and thoughtful person who did a commissioned study for the UK government and came to the conclusion that we could do nothing about the course of the world between now and 2030. but that if we didn't dramatically reduce carbon discharge and shift to renewable energies over the next several years, there would be a catastrophe between 2030 and 2050. And if you want to read one of the most remarkable polemics ever rendered unto print, it's a book called Heat by George Monbiot, the scientist, populist writer for The Guardian, in which he makes an unassailable case for the likelihood that we're facing a catastrophe in that period in the middle of the 20th century, and that catastrophe will be felt by the poorest people in the poorest countries of the world. So when you put it all together, and I refuse not to confront this, I refuse to have my ardor and my hope reduced, but I refuse not to confront the very bleak reality of what we're dealing with, which could well be compounded in an entirely unhelpful and sad fashion by the response to the international financial crisis. So, who should lead the response? Well, obviously, the G8 is entirely equipped to lead the response in terms of providing the resources and the environmental economic framework which is required. But they have failed on debt. The Doha round has collapsed, which means we will not have a fair international trading regimen. And not a single member of the G8 has yet reached 0.7% of gross national product, which was agreed upon as far back as 1970 to be devoted to foreign aid. And it's interesting that Sweden and Norway and Denmark and Luxembourg and Holland and Finland can now or have in the past have met or exceeded the 0.7, but not a single member of the G8 has yet attained it. And as long as they are not willing to put into place that kind of investment in the needs of the developing world, then we are in a tremendous difficulty. And I say shamelessly that my hope is that the emergence of Barack Obama is going to change the dynamic of the G8 profoundly, that the consortium, the consortium of Blair and Bush just didn't work. The coalition of Brown and Obama might work quite wonderfully in the G8 constellation, because Brown, more than most, has spoken so strongly of poverty, disease, and conflict, and Obama is obviously a person of real feeling in those areas. So my sense is that that's where you derive the hope in terms of the larger patterns. Now, frankly, the second area that should provide the leadership is the United Nations itself. And I'm not going to excoriate it. I'm simply going to say in general terms that the United Nations has failed lamentably in dealing with women and with gender generally. So lamentably that a high-level panel found it necessary to recommend at the end of 2006 that the United Nations create a separate international agency for women. And the United Nations is in the process of doing that, and I suspect it will come into being during the course of this session before next summer. And that will be a remarkable achievement, but it's also a reflection of the absence of support for women's rights and women's needs.